rail agency PRASA says it's likely to be able to reopen the Mabopane train corridor by the end of the month. That's just 2 weeks from now. You remember the huge vandalism on that track. Railway tracks literally stolen, cable from stations on top of all of the other problems PRASA has. This affects the lives of hundreds of thousands, millions of people who should be able to use trains to get to work and to get home safely every day. Professor Rose Luke is at the College of Business and Economics. She's in the Department of Transport and Supply Chain Management. Professor Luke, good afternoon to you, and thanks for your time. PRASA's been in such a bad way for so long. It affects millions of people. It must also have a huge economic impact.
Stephen, thank you very much. It has a massive economic impact. I think if you think about the commuting public, and particularly something like the Mabopane route, where you have a few 100,000 commuters every week, those commuters having to move on to other forms of transport, such as cars or buses or taxis, would obviously have to pay quite a premium to do that. So just from an individual perspective, it's very expensive, but also from an economic impact to the country, to the roads, it's massive. So it's a really, really important move.
I mean, we obviously need a sort of different transport system. People getting on taxis is one thing, but people are spending, 40% of their salaries on transport, a lot of that on the minibus taxi industry. I imagine in a perfect world we'd need a new transport system, but is getting PRASA working, and particularly the Mabopane corridor, is this a good place to start? If we get that working, it'll make a big difference, perhaps?
Yes, I think what we hear about the Mabopane corridor is that it's going to be something completely new and something different. I think it's an ideal opportunity for PRASA to create a demonstration project that is going to be able to show that PRASA is indeed turning around. And I think it's really important. We do need to rethink transport. We need to think big. But we've got a massive commuting public, and I think that by moving a lot of people every day, we need to have big solutions. And that's where rail really needs to come into its own. There's a limit to what can be carried by taxis and buses at the end of the day. So yes, we do need to look at how heavy rail can contribute to this.
I mean, if you look at our apartheid spatial development, and I'm talking specifically about how job opportunities, jobs are in sort of city areas, industrial areas, people still for economic reasons have to live in township areas, often very far away. It was, deliberately designed. Rail is the one cheap way to get around all of that.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch your last sentence.
Rail is one cheap way to get around all of that, is that if you can move people in and out of these areas very quickly and very safely, what it means is that they are not going to spend quite so much time commuting, not 2 hours to get to work and not 2 hours to get from work as they do now.
Yes, I think absolutely. The apartheid system obviously created massive spatial distortion, and that is with us today, but that for all the more reason why we need to have such good mass transit systems. It is one way of reducing time spent in traffic, reducing frustrations. I know many people are getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning just to get to work and getting back late at night. So well-functioning public transport system is aimed at alleviating that, and that's what we should be trying to do with this Mabopane corridor.
PRASA's had such a bad time. I mean, there was state capture, there was all sorts of things going on at PRASA at the time. Then we've had this vandalism, this theft of infrastructure during lockdown. I mean, in a way, you want to ask, is it possible to rebuild PRASA? Do we need to look at the problem differently? Do we need a different agency? Do we need something else? I know privatization is a part of that conversation.
Yeah, I certainly think, it's difficult for me to answer anything specifically about the structuring of PRASA, but I think certainly that when one looks at rail in the country, there's certainly scope for private sector involvement. I think there will always be a role for the state, but certainly, especially on the freight side, there's certainly scope for private sector involvement. After all, on the freight side, it is really economic goods, so there's no reason why the private sector should not be involved.
It looks like that's going to happen by March. You'd have private sector trains, or privately owned trains, carrying cargo on state-owned railways. That was in the medium-term budget policy statement last week. Is someone going to make some money out of that? I mean, they'll be giving that money in the form of fees to government, so it suddenly means more income for government.
Yeah, I think again it's a good question and one I'm not sure I'm positioned to answer. But one would certainly expect that there would be private sector involvement for the purposes of profit. It's the reason why the private sector would be involved.
One of the interesting things about a railway system, if you get it to run properly, is that it makes a huge difference to people's lives. But the political problem with the railway system is that it can take a long time. So in other words, if, for example, government were to announce now that there's going to be, let's just say, for argument's sake, a doubling of PRASA's mandate, is going to have a lot more railways, run a lot more trains, you're still probably looking at least 5 to 10 years before people see the benefits of that. And that makes it quite difficult to plan. To plan a railway is actually quite a difficult thing to do.
Yes, it's a long-term investment, and one can see that with the planning of the Gautrain. The planning took many years before it actually got off the ground. So I think the essence of this is one must take a long-term vision or long-term perspective and go beyond short-term gain into thinking long-term what might be best for the country and its people.
Does that mean that politically people sometimes make short-term decisions? No one really thinks of the long-term, especially if you have to pay the money now and you only get the benefit later.
Yeah, and I think that is very often the issue is the elections come around more quickly than one can plan a railway.
Professor Rose Luke, thank you, from the College of Business and Economics in the Department of Transport and Supply Chain Management at the University of Johannesburg.